A single knock at the door in the dead of night. The sound carries through a narrow alleyway, past oil lamps guttering in clay brackets, and into a home that had already shrunk to 2 rooms and a single pantry after months of siege. A father goes to the threshold, and the messenger's seal, an emblem of Babylon, catches the lamplight like a verdict. In the year 586 BC, that seal could mean many things: the taking of food, the collecting of taxes, the demand for hostages. For some families, it meant something far worse. This is the story of a ritual imposed by Nebuchadnezzar that, according to the evidence we can assemble, killed its victims, whether directly or by a chain of cruelty that led to psychological and physical death. What we can say with confidence is this: power, centralized and unaccountable, turned bodies and identities into instruments of spectacle and control. What follows tries to recover, as carefully as the sources allow, how that mechanism worked and what it left behind. The young woman at the center of this account is not a named figure in an ancient inscription. She is instead a composite, an emblematically representative captive drawn from the kinds of lives the Hebrew Bible, Babylonian records, and later scholarship suggest were disrupted and destroyed in the wake of Jerusalem's fall. For the sake of narrative clarity, we will call her Miriam, while insisting that Miriam is a reconstruction, made of fragments, testimony, and plausible inference. Her story stands as a way to make visible the daily reality behind political headlines: the deportation lists, the royal boasts, the silence of palace registers. Nebuchadnezzar II is present in every line of this story by title and by consequence. As the king of Babylon, he presided over one of the most dramatic imperial expansions of the late Bronze and early Iron Ages. His campaigns brought military victory and the transfer of immense wealth and population into Babylon. The biblical books of Kings and Jeremiah describe a siege that culminated in the destruction of Solomon's temple, the burning of the city, and the forcible removal of many inhabitants to Babylon. Babylonian royal inscriptions and administrative texts, for all their celebratory silence about the more sordid details of imperial life, confirm policies of deportation and resettlement as instruments of control. Taken together, these records make clear why captives, men, women, children, were valuable, as labor, as hostages, as symbols of conquered authority. Imagine then Miriam leaving her mother's courtyard, her hands empty, the household shrine closed. Imagine her not as an anonymous mass, but as someone known by a neighbor's voice, by the name used at home, by the knot in her mother's apron that only she could fix.
The convoy that carried her to Babylon folded distance into a reverse geography: ash and ruin behind, a city of mud brick and canals ahead. The palace, a horizon of glazed cedar and gilt that deflected the light like armor. For the imperial city presented itself as comfort and inevitability, gardens, lodgings, and a court that expected obedience. But these golden facades contained mechanisms designed precisely to obliterate previous loyalties and remold captives into instruments of state interest. What did that remolding look like? The sources are fragmentary, and where they are silent, historians reconstruct from patterns of imperial practice across Near Eastern polities. Some features are well attested. Captives could be renamed, given house assignments, put to work in palatial households or temple precincts. Their legal status shifted from citizen to property with few rights. It is also clear that gender mattered. Women and girls, valued in many ancient states, both as labor and as objects of political symbolism, were often assigned to households, temples, or specific roles within elite circles. That assignment, however, was rarely a neutral act of employment. It was a reconfiguration of identity. Identity erasure took many forms. Names mattered as legal and social anchors. To remove a name or to replace it with a number or a foreign name was to sever a person from the web of obligations and protections that previously defined them. Clothing could function as both garment and restraint. Tokens, distinctive garments, or signs placed on individuals marked them as belonging to certain houses or offices. These were not merely convenient labels. They operated as instruments of control. The placing of a distinctive sash, a different hairstyle prescribed by overseers, a token sewn into a garment, each of these could transform social perception, altering how others addressed the captive, and crucially, how the captive could perceive herself. Surveillance and social isolation amplified these measures. Captives were overseen by palace officials and household managers, whose authority was backed by soldiers and economic leverage. Movement was restricted. Communications with family were controlled, often reduced to occasional letters or dispatched tokens that could be used to demand obedience from the households back home. The long-term aim was clear: sever the captive's social moorings until adaptation, compliance, became the path of least resistance. But identity erasure alone does not explain the forms of cruelty that produced the deaths we can infer. Something else made these acts uniquely lethal: the conversion of private violation into public spectacle. The notion of spectacle here does not mean the lascivious exhibitionism of a modern tabloid.
It means a deliberate political choreography in which the subjection of captives served a purpose beyond the moment, to display the extent of imperial power, to normalize domination among the elite who watched, and to bind the court together in complicity. We have to be careful. No royal inscription tells us we staged rituals of humiliation. No administrative tablet reads like a police log of atrocities. Yet other kinds of evidence and patterns of behavior allow reasonable reconstructions. The Hebrew prophetic literature, for instance, often condemns the abuse of the poor and the capture of innocents, and at moments implies that the conquerors repurposed human beings for the maintenance of glory. Jeremiah, in Lament and Accusation, records the pain of deportation and the humiliation of a people scattered. The Babylonian administrative apparatus, represented in tablets that catalog workers, rations, and the movement of goods, demonstrates how thoroughly the state could reorganize lives. Secondary scholarship on imperial courts shows that ritualized displays involving captives or eunuchs often functioned as both entertainment and political theater across the ancient Near East. From these building blocks, a plausible picture emerges. Captives were sometimes paraded, inspected, and presented for selection in ways that blurred labor assignment, sexual control, and political message. Think of a precinct in the king's household, a guarded courtyard lined with glazed bricks and images of protective deities. Courtiers gather, officials, priests, mercantile benefactors, dressed to display status. Nearby, captives stand apart, arrayed, clothed in garments that mark their servile status. The court may call for particular presentations: a fatherless girl offered for service in a temple household, a woman designated for the kitchens of a high official, a group displayed before an elite audience to demonstrate the king's bounty and the reach of his conquest. The presentation itself becomes part of the capture's punishment: the public knowledge that one's body, one's privacy, and one's future are under accusation, under appraisal, under sovereign control. Those who watch are implicated. They participate in a system where human beings pass as tokens of victory. What was the daily texture of this instrument of power? It worked both through direct commands and through the slower violence of anticipation. A young captive might be told that she will appear before the palace for selection. She waits. She is kept in provisional lodgings, rooms that provide shelter but not privacy, attendants that watch more than they serve. She is instructed in new names or marks. She is given particular clothing, perhaps a veil or a sash, that makes her visible to the elite and limits her mobility. She is told to perform, to sing a courtly song, to recite a lineage, to dance, to show obedience.
When the ceremony is postponed, typical in courts with constant ceremonies, the delay becomes part of the torment. Night after night of sleeplessness, the mind rehearses the worst possibilities. In time, the captive's identity disassociates from her past self in a survival strategy that also deepens her dislocation. Anticipation, in this sense, is a slow-burning cruelty, equal to and sometimes more destructive than sudden physical violence. Some chroniclers and modern scholars suspect that specific ceremonial forms associated with royal households included ordeals that bore ritual significance. Forms designed to test obedience, to consecrate a person for a particular space, or to mark their integration into the court's social fabric. Here the evidence grows tenuous and must be handled with caution. Primary texts do not lay out a step-by-step ordeal for captive girls in Babylonian courts. Where the idea of a ritual appears likely, it is often reconstructed from comparative evidence, ritual practices in neighboring cultures, patterns of elite behavior, and literary idioms in prophetic literature that describe captivities in ritual terms. Thus, when we describe a possible structure, preparation, parade, staged selection, a period of enforced compliance, we do so as a plausible reconstruction, not as a transcript. Even when we treat such sequences as reconstructions, the consequences are visible in the surviving record. The Hebrew Bible preserves accounts of women who suffer and die in exile, the collapse of households, and the breakdown of lineages, and prophetic laments that understand deportation as more than a physical removal. It is a social and spiritual dismemberment. Babylonian administrative tablets show captives allocated to houses and temples where their survival depended on the goodwill of their overseers. Archaeological layers, too, reveal shifts in household assemblages consistent with forced resettlement, domestic items, dress fragments, and changes in ceramic usage that mark cultural displacement. These elements, assembled carefully, allow us to trace probable outcomes. Some captives adapted and survived. Others perished, sometimes directly because of neglect or exposure, sometimes because they took their own lives to end intolerable humiliation. What does death look like in such a context, and why does it matter whether we label it direct or indirect? The distinction matters because of responsibility and the mechanisms of power. A direct killing would be an execution or a violent assault that results in immediate mortal injury. An indirect killing occurs when an institution creates conditions, persistent humiliation, deprivation of care, enforced isolation, that make death more likely. Both forms are moral crimes, but they reveal different things about how empires worked. Direct killing is the blunt instrument of coercion.
Indirect killing is the structural violence of policy, making life so unbearable that death is one of the possible outcomes, making survival contingent upon total compliance. Contemporary testimony and later narrative traditions suggest all of these outcomes occurred. Some girls appear to have died after being forced into roles that exposed them to disease and neglect, lacking access to food or adequate shelter. Others succumbed to despair, the psychological collapse sometimes recorded in euphemistic terms in the literature of the period. There are hints in prophetic voices that certain humiliations were lethal in effect: the loss of marriageability, the stripping of social standing, the inability to return home, all of which could extinguish a future, socially and economically. Around these testimonies, historians assemble more concrete data: lists of dead deportees, tablets noting ration distributions that stop suddenly for certain individuals, and administrative notations indicating reallocation of dependents after a death. Together, these fragments form a pattern of mortality linked to captivity that goes beyond the battlefield. We should also consider the role of the audience, the court watchers, in producing death. Spectacle works in two directions. It punishes the object of the display, and it disciplines the viewer. When elites witness humiliation without protest, they internalize the legitimacy of the act. Social bonds are reconfigured. Complicity becomes a glue that holds the court together. In such settings, harming captives can be instrumentally tied to status. To assert one's proximity to the king, one might sponsor or participate in the ceremonial allocation of captives. The moral cost is absorbed by the social benefit. Over time, the normalization of such ceremonies makes the suffering invisible. Records, when they survive, speak in administrative indifference rather than empathetic account. Families at home bore a different but parallel burden. They experience what scholars call social death, the erasure of kinship bonds that marriage, lineage, and inheritance depend upon. A father left behind could be forced into silence, rewarded for compliance, or threatened for speaking out. There is evidence that some instances of return or compensation followed deportations. Payments or gifts might be arranged to secure quiet. Those payments, however, are not a form of justice. They are a mechanism of erasure, hush money that rewrites the ledger of loss into a transaction, allowing the state to maintain its image while concealing its moral cost. The palace's official stance, in the records that survive, is of course different. Royal inscriptions celebrate the king's victories and the prosperity that follows. They are designed to legitimize, not to confess. It is therefore unsurprising that the mechanisms of abuse rarely appear in the kinds of texts kings commissioned.
When one piece of the official narrative could be paired with another, administrative lists indicating deportation, prophetic laments describing loss, and archaeological signs of demographic shifts, the full picture becomes more coherent. Yet gaps remain, and conscientious reconstruction must highlight them rather than smooth them over. A ritual that is deadly in its effects can be subtle in its operations. Consider a plausible sequence based on historiographical inference. Captives are brought into the precinct. They are assigned badges or garments that mark them as belonging to specific households. The court organizes a presentation where select elites inspect and claim captives. Some captives are sent to temple service, some to domestic labor, others to the houses of officials where their future is uncertain. The court's voice, the king, the officials, the priests, renders the captives both property and spectacle. Those captives who cannot adapt, who resist, or who are judged untidy or unfit may find themselves neglected, rations reduced, medical care withheld, or social ostracism intensified. In multiple recorded contexts across the ancient Near East, starvation, disease, and despair followed when institutional support was withdrawn. What looks like isolated tragedy is often the predictable endpoint of an institutional design that minimizes visibility of harm while maximizing the political utility of domination. Some readers will rightly ask whether we can move from this reconstruction to a claim that Nebuchadnezzar himself ordered a specific deadly ritual. Here, historians must resist the lure of sharp certainty where the sources are ambiguous. Nebuchadnezzar presided over a state whose apparatuses allowed atrocity to happen under his reign. The policies of deportation and resettlement he enacted created the conditions under which such state violence could be administered. Direct evidence of the king personally ordering such a ritual is not preserved in the same way his building projects and military victories are. What can be demonstrated, however, is the correlation between imperial policy and the outcomes for those brought into the king's orbit. The title of this account, asserting that a ritual imposed by Nebuchadnezzar was deadly, should be read in that light, a claim about responsibility by institutional design, rather than an accusation that Nebuchadnezzar kept a ledger of private ritual prescriptions. When we say imposed by Nebuchadnezzar, we mean the order and logic of the empire he led, and how that order translated into practices in the palace and household. Whatever the responsibility of the king in a narrow personal sense, the moral responsibility of the institution is harder to deny. The state's capacity to silence complaints, to reallocate victims without public reckoning, and to make return or restitution contingent upon submission all point to a system that invested in secrecy and denial.
Silence was a political commodity, paid for, coerced, or produced by the social shame associated with victimhood. Survivors who did return were often stigmatized. Communities sought to protect honor by burying what had happened. That suppression of testimony extended the harm. It prevented communal grief, blocked accountability, and allowed the spectacle to continue with new victims in subsequent campaigns. The consequences of such systemic violence are not merely immediate, they shape memory. Imperial narratives, on clay, on stone, and in the mouths of victors, tend to archive glory and ignore shame. Victim voices, when they survive, do so in poetry and lament, in prophetic cries, and in legal residues that show damage in the margins. The Hebrew prophets, particularly Jeremiah, produce wrenching evidence of what exile does to personal and communal life, the uprooting of religion, the hunger for home, the muting of joy. These voices are not dry records of procedure, they are moral testimony. They remind us that history's losers narrate their grief in forms that are not administrative, but are arguably closer to the truth of suffering. There is also a long-term social effect when the spectacle of domination becomes an instrument through which elites assert membership and power. The moral imagination of a society shifts. Acts that might once have been shameful become rites of passage for social climbing. The normalization of humiliation corrodes civic bonds. It makes posture and complicity the currency of advancement. In this sense, the palace is not merely a site of consumption, but a school of ethics, one that teaches how to ignore harm when it confers advantage. So what then are we left to conclude? First, that the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC and the resulting deportations created a set of institutional conditions conducive to abuse and death. Second, that captives, especially women and girls, experienced a range of violences that included identity erasure, enforced visibility, isolation, and psychological torment. Third, that some of the deaths tied to these practices were direct, others indirect, but many were preventable in a different institutional arrangement. Fourth, that the responsibility for these outcomes lies not only with individuals, but with a state apparatus that made such outcomes predictable and to some extent invisible. Memory, finally, is our ethical instrument for resisting such erasures. Recovering the stories of people like Miriam is not merely an academic exercise. It is a moral act that demands attention to the mechanisms of power and to the ways language and record-keeping often protect the powerful while marginalizing victims. When historians annotate conjecture and identify gapless areas where evidence is thin, they are not hedging for rhetorical cowardice. They are making room for humility in the face of human complexity.
To say some sources suggest, or it is likely that, is not to evade responsibility. It is to state where the evidence is strong and where it is reconstructive. There is also a present tense lesson in this ancient case. The dynamics that allowed cruelty in Nebuchadnezzar's time, centralized authority, institutional secrecy, social incentives for complicity, have modern analogs. That is not to equate ancient and modern systems directly, but to note structural affinities. Societies that concentrate power without robust checks can find ways to normalize harm. Spectacle, whether in a palace courtyard or a media-saturated public square, can function to obscure culpability and fashion complicity. Remembering the victims of the past humbles us and warns us. The machinery of domination tends to reproduce itself, and it is the work of communities, scholars, and institutions to break the cycle. What then can we say about what is known and what remains conjecture? The deportation policies of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon are well attested in both biblical accounts and Babylonian administrative practices. The existence of captives in palace households and temple precincts is documented. The existence of ritualized presentations or forms of forced visibility in some ancient Near Eastern courts is plausible through comparative evidence. The particular ceremonial steps of any single ritual involving captive girls in Babylon are, however, not preserved in a detailed, verifiable form. The lethal outcomes we describe are supported by a convergence of biblical testimony, administrative patterns indicating abrupt terminations of sustenance, and archaeological evidence of disrupted household continuity. Where direct textual confirmation is absent, the argument relies on careful and conservative reconstruction, grounded in patterns rather than sensational speculation. If this narrative stirs the desire to explore the sources directly, consult the relevant portions of the Hebrew Bible, 2 Kings, and the Book of Jeremiah for the biblical narrative of Jerusalem's fall and deportation. Look to Babylonian administrative tablets and royal inscriptions for the architecture of imperial policy, noting that royal inscriptions are propagandistic and often omit the unflattering details of governance. Seek secondary scholarship on deportation practices and gender in the ancient Near East for interpretive frameworks that help translate administrative data into human lives. And when using any modern analysis, be mindful of disciplinary debates. Scholars dispute the extent to which certain courtly practices can be generalized across time and place. Where the record is thin, the responsible historian must say so. There is grief in this story. There is also indictment.
Not every detail can be proven, but enough of the pattern is sufficiently documented to sustain the central claim that an institutionalized practice under Nebuchadnezzar's rule operated in ways that turned captive girls into objects of spectacle and instruments of political control, and that this process was often lethal in its consequences. To remember this is to resist erasure, to place the victims back into the historical accounting, and to allow their suffering to inform our judgments about power and the moral obligations of states. If you want source notes and a deeper dive into the primary and secondary texts behind this reconstruction, subscribe and check the description for links to further reading. For those who lived through 586 BC, the story did not end with the king's victory. It continued in quiet rooms, in broken households, and in the muted songs of those who remembered what the empire had taken. Our work as readers and historians is to listen to those muted songs, to reconstruct carefully, and to refuse the comfort of narratives that explain away the cost of conquest. Remembering is a kind of reckoning, a demand that we weigh the human consequences of power, then and now. There are no easy consolations to offer. What we can do is insist on clarity about evidence, refuse sensationalism, and place moral responsibility where it lies, in institutions that design harm into their procedures, and in societies that profit from silence. The death of a captive is not merely a casualty of war. It is a testimony against systems that make such deaths predictable. If the past is a mirror, let it show us what happens when spectacle displaces compassion and bureaucracy displaces personhood. In the end, the story of Miriam and of the many unnamed women she represents is a call to attention. It asks historians and citizens alike to interrogate the ways power becomes spectacle, to honor the dignity of those who suffered, and to ensure that memory is more than a footnote in a king's triumphal inscription. If the evidence is partial, the moral imperative is not: to remember, to document, and to learn. If this account moved you, share your thoughts in the comments and consult the sources linked below for a fuller, annotated reading list that explains which elements are documentary and which are careful reconstructions.